That wraps up this analysis for episode 2 of Band of Brothers, geez. Let's try that again. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this episode we are going to continue our examination of Apple TV's World War II miniseries, Masters of the Air. The last time we left off the 100th Bomb Group, they had had their first trial by fire, and here in episode 2 we are going to see how things progress as leaders come and go and as comrades disappear. I would like to make a special acknowledgement to the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. On their website, you can find an absolute treasure trove of historical materials and photographs that has been incredibly helpful in our gathering of material for these episodes, including photographs provided by family members. We encourage you to visit their website, follow them on Facebook, and support them in whatever way you see most fitting. With all of that said, let's go ahead and take a look at episode 2 of Masters of the Air. One thing that I lament in regard to the opening credits is that there are no veteran interviews, as was the case with Band of Brothers in the Pacific. I think that was a very profound, cold opening, shall we say. And perhaps this is merely due to the passing of time and that there's so few men of the 100th Bomb Group who are left. I was under the impression that a number of interviews were done by Tom Hanks's Playtone Productions, perhaps as long back as a decade ago. And I'm just somewhat surprised that they didn't put those interviews, if they exist, or one similar to them, here at the beginning, because certainly there aren't many of these gentlemen left, and it's certainly worthwhile to reflect upon what they have to say. So we are resuming now on June 25th, 1943, picking up where the previous episode left off with the mission to Bremen, Germany. And I like these scenes of interrogation and questioning after the mission. This was commonplace, done in all bomb groups, regardless of their location. And this was a time to process, to gather intelligence. This is when your commanding officers would try to figure out who was missing, and they would ask men, well, what did you see with this plane or that plane? Did you see any chutes open? And then in turn, that information would often be handed off to the International Red Cross. So there could be some sort of accounting as to exactly who was missing, and their family members could be notified. That was just one of many things that was cataloged in these interrogations. But most importantly, what went right and what went wrong? Who did their job and perhaps who didn't do their job quite as well? And this was part of the steep learning curve that went with bombing industrial targets in cities.
We're going to send you to Redgrave Hospital. Get you all fixed up.
Can't wait to get back in the fight, sir.
Steve Bosser of the 350th Squadron was in fact a real person, and he was also a ball turret gunner. He was a ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Sweater Gal, which is one of many great names that we can associate with these missions and these men. And he did in fact get back into the swing of things, because he not only completed all 25 missions, which was a feat in and of itself. But then he completed another 5 missions on top of that. And so it really says something about individuals as such, where he voluntarily goes on an additional 5 dangerous missions when he doesn't have to. And the level of fortitude to get back into that cramped, claustrophobic ball turret really speaks to in this case, a truly special caliber of person. But believe it or not, statistically speaking, the ball turret was actually the safest position in a B-17, and that is something that often surprises people.
Well, I ain't Colonel Hugland.
At this moment, the audience is introduced to Colonel Chick Harding, and he's perhaps the Colonel Sink equivalent in this show, if we're going to make another Band of Brothers correlation. And around July 1st, July 2nd, 1943, he became the commander of the 100th Bomb Group. And As always, Harry Crosby had something to reflect upon, and this is what he had to say. On July 1st, Colonel Harold Hughlin became the commanding officer of the 13th Wing, the unit which coordinated our operations with the 95th and 390th Groups. We knew he had developed stomach ulcers, and the flyboys exulted about how they had driven him away. When Colonel Neil Chick Harding took over on the 2nd, we looked at him warily. We knew he was old time. We knew he was West Point, a football hero there, a blocking back. We heard that he was the basketball coach at the Point. We knew he had flown in the early missions in Africa, and we had heard that he had participated in somehow storing oil and gas supplies ahead of the drive across North Africa. He was short, a little thick through the middle, and he smiled a lot. Not raunch, but easygoing. The flyboys instantly preferred him to Hughlin, the ramrod.
I want to write the letters to the families of the boys that we lost. You'll be better coming from me, someone that they never met.
This conversation speaks to the shuffling of commanders as Hughlin and Harding are trying to fit leaders for size, and these men include Captain Robert Flesher, Captain Jack Kidd, who's part of this conversation, Captain Ollie Turner, and so many more. And another thing of interest in this conversation is that Egan did, in fact, write letters to the families of fallen men, which I can only imagine must have been a mentally exhausting responsibility. And I think one of the big questions is, how do you write letters like that without them all sounding the same and without it really digging into your soul throughout the entire process as the war progresses? Hard stuff to imagine. Now we have a great shot of the Women's Land Army, as it was known, at work. The WLA had originally been devised during World War I, but it was reestablished in June of 1939 as war was looming on the horizon. Women could either enlist or be drafted, and conscription was something that became more and more common. But by 1944, there were over 80,000 so-called land girls that were in this realm of service, and they cared for farms, they did dairy work, they conducted forestry, they caught rats because rats were getting into all the fodder for farm animals. And sadly, they were doing all this, and well, perhaps it shouldn't be expected, they were getting paid less than their male counterparts who were doing the same work at the time. But even so, I'm really glad their contributions are being shown here, even if in a subtle way.
Every man who flew a B-17 thanked God for our ground crews.
So here we are on July 16th, 1943, and it's certainly worth mentioning the responsibilities of crew chiefs, mechanics, and maintenance men. The flyboys had ultimate respect for those individuals who were left behind as they flew their missions because they saw their responsibilities as going hand in hand. This was a round-the-clock responsibility. Duties came in various forms quite naturally. The airmen slept while the mechanics worked. In short, that's how a lot of this played out. And they would build little huts from scrap wood beside the hard stands. Sometimes they would work all night on these planes to get them in flying condition. And it was indeed their great task to get as many planes as possible to fly in the air. That is an incredibly daunting obligation when you step back and think of it. And in moments like this, war was the mother of invention. There are some accounts that when these mechanics and these various crewmen didn't have enough tin, let's say, they would actually get the tin from sea ration cans, they would pound them out, and then they would use those to cover the holes caused by flak or bullets on the B-17s entrusted to their care. So they often had to use a degree of improvisation as they were going about their work.
Corporal Ken Lemons was one of our best crew chiefs. He was 19 years old.
We again see Ken Lemons here, who is sort of the symbolic figure meant to represent all of the ground crews. He was born in 1922 in northern Arkansas, and from what I've read in his memoir, he became accustomed to machine work as he was laboring on the farm back home. And like many of our characters, he signed up right after Pearl Harbor. In fact, he had a brother who was also a brother named Courteous, a good name, who was in the service as well. And prior to shipping out overseas, Ken married his childhood sweetheart, whose name was Fonda. And so likewise, like many of the other characters, he is also a married man. He became one of the first crew chiefs with the 351st Squadron within the 100th Bomb Group, and he, over time, came to care for some of the very famously named aircraft within that unit. Mason-Dixon, Piccadilly Lily is a famous one. Another one, She-Hasta, She-Has-Ta, great names. Boeing Bell, and so many more.
See it? Oh, yeah. Tomorrow after the boys take off, we're going to clean the hard stands.
A hard stand is pretty much a circular parking space. The plane can be rotated 360 degrees there, makes it a little bit easier for the mechanics to take care of any issues at hand. Harry Crosby said that these hard stands were often placed about 200 feet apart at Thorpe Abbott's. And one veteran told me that the reason that these various air bases had hard stand as such, kind of these paved pathways leading off the main strip, is that the Army Air Forces had very much on their minds what had befallen a lot of their aircraft at Pearl Harbor. All of their planes were parked close together, and that made them sitting ducks for strafing Japanese fighters. And so they didn't want that to happen again. After all, the Luftwaffe could follow formations back to base, especially if they were heading back as it was getting dark, mingle in with American aircraft as far as the radar goes. And so being conscious of spacing your planes apart was very much on their minds.
We're still waiting on replacement forts from Poddington. I'm hoping to get one or two of those next week.
The issue of replacements was just a huge challenge. The Air War Plans Division, case in point, estimated that they would need 135,000 pilots. They would need something like 900,000 technicians. You'd need somewhere between 50 and 75,000 non-flying officers. And then you need another million or so non-technical personnel just to keep this whole endeavor afloat. The numbers of it are just mind-boggling. Additionally, the WPD said that they would need something like 2,100, 2,200 replacement aircraft per month. This was the anticipation in regard to the attrition rates. Just horrendous stuff. And you really get the sense as a result that they saw these airmen as statistics, as men who were an expendable means to an end.
We bomb at night because it doesn't matter what we hit as long as it's German. But bombing during the day is suicide. So
we often see that these different philosophies often played out on a different battlefield, and that is in the pub, like we see here. And sure enough, daylight precision bombing was really at odds with what the Royal Air Force had been doing for some time by the time that these American airmen started arriving in Britain in 1942. When you think about somebody like Bomber Harris, who was one of the staunchest of advocates for so-called city busting, as he referred to it, which in other words was high saturation bombing of high density areas in regard to both population and industry. And Winston Churchill was fully supportive of all this. A lot of this was rooted in the desire for retribution, but I believe Churchill referred to it as dehousing the Germans. This is something that was implemented to the utmost. all in all, I mean, these two Allied air forces continued their seemingly disparate ways with considerable efficiency. And one airman referred to this as round-the-clock bombing. The British would bomb by night, the Americans would bomb by day. That would give them a psychological edge. That would allow them to get into the minds of Germans who were the victims of all of this. Just a lot of emotional shock in addition to physical damage. Not only destroy their homes and destroy their factories, but deprive them of sleep and any sense of security.
Would you rather have been a fighter pilot, Major?
Buck is a fighter pilot. Fighter pilot who happens to fly a bus.
Fighter pilot who happens to fly a bus. I absolutely love that line. That's a perfect representation. But in all earnestness, most airmen truly desired to be flying P-47s or later on P-51s, P-38s. These were the aircraft that could really dart through the sky. This is what was often depicted in Hollywood renditions of the war in the early stages of that conflict. There was a degree of glamour and sexiness with flying a fighter. But this was something that the men came to terms with. They recognized that they were doing their part regardless of what sort of aircraft they were in fact flying.
The Norden bomb site. Outside the atomic bomb, it was the most closely held secret of the war.
The Norden that we see here, it may sound simplistic, but it was pretty much an analog calculator. And it had the capacity to measure air density, wind, airspeed, ground speed, and it would essentially fly the plane to the target on the bomb run. And as Harry Crosby says here, it was one of the greatest secrets of the war and one of the most effective instruments of the war itself. And what it really did is that it lent some heft to this figurative saying that American airmen could drop one of their bombs in a pickle barrel that was at the ground level.
In a way, they were on every flight with us.
This line where Crosby acknowledges the people on the ground saying they were on every mission with us, it is so, so true. The activities on the ground were just a constant rumble. I mean, these places were like ant farms. They were locations that never slept. And I like a lot of the shots in this episode as we see things that are being prepared. All pilots had something that they called a poop sheet, which was pretty much a checklist of things that they had to do, things that they had to make sure were working. A lot of this stuff was prepared by people on the ground. You had the navigational element, you had the weather. There was just so much. And then there was the physical items that you had to pack for the airmen themselves. One thing that we saw earlier was something like this. And this is a silk map of France. This is something that was handed out to the men, quite obviously, because if they have to ditch in the Channel, the North Sea, or some other body of water, this isn't going to turn to a bunch of mush.
And the target for today is...
There was always a theatrical or a melodramatic nature of anticipation as the target's revealed, as the curtain is pulled back. And Crosby later said of this environment that this room always smelled like three things. He said it smelled like smoke, tobacco, and a little bit of fear. One thing that in fact surprises me that there aren't more people smoking in this series. I mean, these rooms would be covered in bluish gray palls of smoke. The mess halls, the briefing room, the offices, there aren't enough people smoking. But anyway, what we're talking about here, the mission to Trondheim, Norway, July 24th, 1943, it was a long and difficult one. I think it was the furthest one that the 100th Bomb Group had flown up until that time. It was nearly 2,000 miles. A lot of that was over the sea. There's no landforms that you can use for any sort of orientation. So it really put these guys to the next level. as far as their abilities to travel and navigate went. The mission to Trondheim was a very important one for Crosby, and in fact, one of the opening sections of his book, this event serves as a little bit of prologue in his memoir, and he talks about the moment that he arrived on scene and he has this huge task being placed in front of him. And he wrote, "Already most of the planes parked at the hard stands, about 200 feet apart in the long perimeter row, had their fans going. Blake and his crew were all in the plane, the engines running up in their pre-flight test. The group navigator, Lieutenant Omar Gonzalez, came up in a Jeep and handed me the maps and briefing materials. 'You drew a long one, Harry,' he said. 'I'm sorry we couldn't brief you. I plotted the course on the map and put the coordinates in your logbook.' Then he smiled shyly. 'I hope you will make the navigators look good.'" And so, a little bit of a difference from what we see here, but oh my goodness, Crosby was so worried having this responsibility thrust upon him.
Welcome aboard, Lieutenant.
Came as quick as I could, Major.
It's also worthwhile to note that it was actually Colonel Harding and not Egan who was in the co-pilot's seat on Crosby's plane that day.
Just doing some calculations, Major. There you are.
Of this aha moment where he discovers Trondheim in the distance, Crosby had this to say. "Down below and ahead, there was a puff of smoke, and then another puff, and then a lot of smoke. Smoke screen! In trying to protect our target, the Germans had revealed it. My heart beating so hard that it hurt, I looked down at Norway, a long inlet from the sea with two smaller round lakes connected. I tore at my map. In all of Norway, there was no other body of water that looked like a penis and two testicles. Navigator to pilot, ETA to IP, 8 minutes, he said. Be prepared for a left turn to 285 degrees. Left turn at target, 255. Bombardier, I can't see that there will be any drift correction." All kinds of Rogers were heard, and the bomb run preparation had begun. That's a great little anecdote that's very well represented here in what we see. Now, from what I understand, I believe some of the shots used here are one of the life-size model planes that they had on set. I could be wrong. In any case, Biddick's plane did indeed crash on the way back from the Trondheim mission, and a Major Marvin Bowman had this to say. This is what he wrote in his diary on July 24th, not only of the mission, but of the fate of Biddick's plane. Group engaged in longest combat mission up to now, ever undertaken by B-17s. Takeoff was at 0800 hours for Trondheim, Norway, and the formation returned at 1954 hours, just under 12 hours. Bombing results were good and all planes returned safely, although Lieutenant Biddick was forced to make a crash landing in the vegetable garden of the commanding officer of an RAF training field in northern Scotland. The natives had never seen Americans or American planes, and their hostility was terrific, according to the crew, which was flown out the next day. On the mission, fighter opposition was light, and flak was only meager. So a great little bit of insight here on what Biddick's crew encountered.
What's the difference between a hippo and a zippo?
What's the difference?
Well, one's really heavy, the other's a little lighter.
That's a great little bit. The likes of Crosby and Frank Murphy had great admiration for American Red Cross workers. And the fact, too, that they were women in most cases may have expedited that affinity to an extent, but there could be anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 men on some of these bases, and then here you have 20 or 30 female Red Cross workers, perhaps an equivalent amount as far as medical staff was concerned. And so the joke is that the Red Cross workers and the nurses were kept under lock and key to prevent them from being harassed a little bit too thoroughly from some of their male counterparts. Blue Skies by Irving Berlin was already a classic in 1943. It had come out in 1926, and it had been covered and still continues to be covered by a lot of artists in more recent years. And the song was naturally an informal anthem for airmen who themselves desired to be sailing through clear blue skies. But I really like this scene because it offers us some much needed comic relief after some really heavy stuff. And it again shows us the really lively spirit of Egan.
You brought the group back home. I got lucky.
When Colonel Harding interacted with Crosby, as we see here, he was heaving nothing but praise on this young lieutenant. And he said the timing was perfect because what had happened is that the civilian workers at the subpens were changing their shifts, and there weren't as many of them present. And all the while, the Germans were changing guard. And with the Norwegians being on their lunch break, a lot more Germans were killed than were civilians who were working at the ground level. And the Norwegian resistance thought that the Americans had planned that out intentionally as such. And so Harding said, the Norwegians love us, for how we executed this mission. And of course, the greatest irony here is the fact that it was all by accident, including Crosby's stroke of good luck. And on that point, he had a rather funny summation of how all of this concluded. He said, "And that was how I got my first medal. That was how I got started on the job that was way over my head. That was how I got involved in the internal warfare of the U.S. Army Air Corps." I love the cinematography done here on this bicycle race sequence. And what I really think that this scene speaks to is the highs and lows of life that these men were going through and the psychological toll of all of that. That you could be bombing a city on the first half of the day, and then you could be palling around having a good time at a party environment in the second half of that day. And a story that comes to mind has to do with my good friend John Homan, who was a veteran of the 489th Bomb Group, where he went through an incredibly harrowing mission in the summer of 1944, and they lost several men, and then they came back to base, and Glenn Miller's band was there for a surprise concert for them. And here are these men tapping their tunes to Tuxedo Junction, for crying out loud. And just a few hours earlier, they had been in the thick of battle. And he said that high and low, that roller coaster of life was something that just bedeviled your mind. And that was one element that made the air war so psychologically difficult for these men. Norwich was indeed bombed. Again, it had been bombed several times throughout the war, but in this particular instance, in July of 1943, Norwich had been bombed in addition with Canterbury, Exeter, Bath, a whole lot of British communities, and these were known as reprisal raids undertaken on the part of the Germans for cities of equal significance in their country having been bombed. And like we see here, airmen on these bases would often sit in the entryway or on top of their bomb shelters. They would watch the flak, they would watch all of the gunfire. In some cases, what was being aimed at was German V-1s being shot from the mainland, and British artillery on the coast or in the countryside would be shooting them down before their juice ran out, and they would land indiscriminately in a highly populated area. And they often said, those who were watching it from a distance, that it was like the greatest fireworks show imaginable. But at the same time, they realized that they were often on the receiving end of fire as such as they were witnessing here. So some scary perspective that they gained. And interestingly enough, episode 2 here has a very similar ending to episode 2 of Band of Brothers. You have this contemplative moment at night as the key protagonist, in this case, Winters and Cleven, look off into the distance. They see a city being bombed. They see tracer rounds and such going through the air, and they wonder about their futures in the process. Both of those episodes in both series written by John Orloff, so a little bit of narrative overlap here, appropriately enough. That wraps up this round of analysis for Masters of the Air here on Real History. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button below. We also invite you to visit the website of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. Once again, a whole lot of great material can be obtained there. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We look forward to seeing you next time, and until that time, stay curious.